This is a very big little princess. It is sitting in a nursery pot, in the nursery container, in the nursery soil, and I'm going to transition it into a growing out pot. I always find it crazy, this first repotting of something from a nursery pot into a bonsai pot. That this was growing in this pot only an hour ago, and I actually needed this saw to get it reduced to this size, and that I can now put it in a much smaller pot. That's insane. Hey, this is Jelle, and today we are repotting a Japanese maple from a nursery container into the first growing out pot. No, not in a bonsai pot. For the first 2 or 3 years after you get a tree from a nursery, it is often good to put it in an oversized pot, so the tree grows nice and strong, and that really allows you to develop the tree a lot faster than in a bonsai pot. So I'm going to transition this from the nursery container into a much shallower pot, ready for developing this as a bonsai. Now typically in end of season clearance you can get material like this for a reasonable price, and the best thing is it is so full of branches you could immediately see this as a new bonsai. In fact, I'm going to air layer this top out, but for now I first need to get it into other substrate. Now what they use in the nursery is regular potting soil, and after a couple of years that condenses, it becomes wet, and that is not good for the roots. Now why do they use it? Because it's really good for growing out, and normally a tree like this will be uppotted every other year, every time getting new fresh soil around the roots, one size up in a pot. Then once you buy it, the plant goes into the full ground and it's not so much of an issue. But if I want to grow it for a bonsai, health over beauty, first get it out of this pot, then remove the old soil. Because the tree is not completely healthy, I'm not going to keep the soil, I'm going to toss it, and then get it into nice and open, healthy bonsai substrate. And now that the buds are swelling, I think it's time to put it in a bigger pot, actually in a different pot. If I look at the branches, I see some black spots that could be indicative of a disease, and typically that is based in bad roots. Now I know it is in bad potting soil, I filled it up of course, I'm going to look at the Nebari, see what it looks like, cut off most of the root base and plant it in a shallow container with good substrate. Let's get started. This is the pot I'm going to plant it up in. Size wise, really reasonable. First step when transitioning nursery stock into a bonsai substrate is of course getting it out of the original nursery pot. A few taps normally helps and gets the pot off. Once you have the pot off, you start looking for the Nebari, and here you can see the Nebari is nice on top. Very often though they're planted very deep, because every time they pot it up they plant it deep and just fill it up. So first always check how high is my Nebari. Now here you see lots and lots of healthy fine roots all along the surface, so I'm convinced this is actually the Nebari level. What that means is that in this repotting I can cut off the root ball. So I don't have to tease out all the roots and all the substrate, I can just lift this, take a big saw and cut half of the root ball off. And I mean that's quite literally. This is completely rooted through, small roots only, so here is a bigger root that I cut, but everything else are just fairly fine roots. Very, very good news. That means all the main roots are still on the root ball and I can start cleaning it up. I'm going to bare root it almost to the core, making sure I get the main root structure out. I also want to know whether these are two separate trees or whether they're fused, and if they're separate trees, whether it's useful to separate these. But for now it's just a matter of very slowly, very gently going around the root ball like this and squeezing out the substrate. At some point I'll have to tilt it and do the same thing here at the bottom. And I know this feels like something very, very drastic, and it is drastic, yes, but at this point in time, just before the tree starts growing, it can handle a lot of root work like this. So don't worry about the health of the tree. If the tree is not too unhealthy, and if the tree was nice and green and had a normal winter, you can do this. Of course, after this sort of work, it's useful to not let the tree go into a deep frost mode anymore. So do this once the tree is waking up and your worst risks of frost have passed. For me it's now late February and it is actually a little bit early. But I have lots of trees and I can put this tree away in a shed if it does start freezing heavily again. It's not expected though. Now sometimes what I do is I take a saw and I just cut sections off on the outside, but here the roots are not circling all that badly, so I'm going to just do it by hand here. Now a top tip, I put my trees on a container. That means that they're elevated and that when I'm removing the substrate it just falls down. That means that I don't have to continuously lift the tree to get rid of the substrate that I just scratched out. Particularly with heavy trees, this is quite useful. And yes, this is a fairly heavy tree. Oh, look at that. There we have one of the roots that I now have broken. Let's prune that straight away, so I'm aware that this is broken. And maybe before that one breaks as well. Now the benefit of removing all this substrate now is that all this organic soil that's in here, once it dries out, it has a very hard time getting wet again. The substrate that I use for my bonsai, however, is very open, and there water can quite easily percolate back in once it dries out. I think that might have been one of the reasons why this tree was doing quite poorly. It's been sitting at a nursery that I know for a long time, and maybe the core of the root ball has dried out in one of the hot summers, and the root ball has been struggling to recover from that. And now that I know how shallow the core root ball is, I actually take a saw and I make it less deep, reducing the amount of work. This really reduces the amount of work that I need to do, and I really hope I'm not cutting any vital roots here, but I think it will be just fine. There we go. And you see here still mainly thin roots. There's no main roots that I've just cut. Now with half of the root ball gone, look at this. Look at how shallow this root ball now already is. I really didn't expect it to go this well, but now I just need to clean out the core here. And this is important because I want good drainage throughout the root ball, and that means having to take out the inner part of the root ball as well. Mind you, this work does cause a lot of stress to the tree, so this next year is also going to be a quiet year. No major styling, just getting it to root into the pot. But yeah, this is what you need to do when you get a tree in a nursery container. Now here I'm quite lucky. The root ball is consisting of a lot of fine roots. If you don't have a lot of fine roots, then what do you do? In theory, you can cut all the branches up to this level and then wait. You allow it to grow for a year, and then when you dig it up, there's going to be lots and lots of fine feeder roots here around the base, and you could cut big. And you could cut back further. Now I know this is quite drastic for some of you, so my recommendation is then to remove as much of the organics as you can, leave as much of the roots intact as you can, just prune them back by 1/3, plant them in a container that will just hold the root ball using nice open substrate, and then letting it grow for a season, and the next year at the repotting season take it out of the pot. At that time you will probably find a lot of fine roots in the pot, and that will give you confidence that you can always cut back to a side root that is already present on the main root, and then slowly you can reduce the size of the root ball. But as said, they can take quite a lot of abuse if done at this time of year. just as the tree is powering up to start growing for the season, is the time that the roots are also going to be repaired very quickly. I'm a little bit out of breath. Didn't expect that. I need to do a bit more sport other than repotting bonsai. Now with a bit of care you can gently open up the roots and that way get in between and scratch out substrate deeper and deeper. If at some point you feel the roots are getting too long and you say, well, I'm not going to use all these roots, I'm going to cut them back anyway, then of course life gets a lot easier if you just take your scissors and say, I'm just going to cut it back. Just cut it like it is hair. Just cut it off without thinking too much, all at the same length, and then you have a lot more space again and you can continue removing substrate. And this is the way that you can get all the way into the core of the root ball, removing most of the organics. Here you have all these small roots that come from this base, and I need to be careful that I don't break these off because I really want to keep them. But here I'm not being very gentle, but don't be too rushed for this. This can easily take a half hour to get completely cleaned out with a root ball of this size. These feeders, they'll regrow in a couple of weeks after the tree wakes up. I can now get more organics out. I always go from the trunk outwards because that's also the direction that I want the roots to grow. So anything that goes across either breaks or is pulled out in the direction that I want to keep it. That's another tip. Also the bottom of the root ball, the bottom of the roots, you need to really clean out. Make sure that it gets nice and fluffy. You don't want any hard transitions later on in your pot. So all these roots, they should be sticking out of whatever is left over at the bottom. I actually try to go down as far as I can. I want to try to reach the base of the tree. I'm going to cut all the roots as short as I can. So whatever comes out, comes off, all the way until I hopefully reach the bottom of the trunk. That can be quite significant how far I need to go. Many iterations of just going from the inside out, pulling all the substrate out. And particularly with a big tree like this one, it's a little bit clumsy. And now I can just make a nice smooth edge, trim the roots back as far as I dare, thinning them out where needed, but for now I'm just going to leave it quite nice and smooth because I'm going to do more work on the roots. But for this I'm going to use a concave cutter. But this regrowth of feeder roots is very quick in spring. As soon as the tree starts growing, roots will start sprouting from all these cut ends. So this really looks a lot worse than it really is. It looks plenty bad, I know. Now one thing of concern is of course the root ball drying out, particularly when I'm doing video. So I'm going to take some water, wash it down so that they stay more humid. Now when I started, I suggested that maybe I can split these two into two trees. But they have really fused, but it also means that I now need to sort out the root ball, because this root comes from the tree on the right and then crosses this trunk to the left. So I'm just going to pop this off. Fortunately, there's other roots down below that can take over. This can also go, there's also a crossing root. And this way I'm now going to slowly clean up the whole root ball. I'm going to go around and around. And here's another one of those roots. Don't need to remove it completely if I can't get to it. Then I'll do that in another year. But for now I'm removing these so that they don't dominate the root ball. And actually, being above ground, they won't grow. They'll just die off over the year. And the same here, there's a lot of heavy roots and I definitely don't need all of them, so let's just remove the first 2 or 3 that are most prominent. This is okay, but it can be a little bit shorter. And now what you also see, there's again lots and lots of substrate that can be gently teased out. And this way, step by step, ever more careful, I'm removing roots and substrate from this root ball, thinning out as I go. And I know it doesn't look like I'm doing this carefully. There's a lot of force involved, I realize that. But it is with deliberation. And particularly the closer I get to the final root ball, the more careful I am with how I remove things. Now here there's a lot of roots in one place, and this is actually way too much. So I'm going to thin it out a little bit as well, so that the roots that remain have space to develop, and you get a more mature root ball, because lots and lots of fine roots in one place is also not pretty. There needs to be taper, movement and age to these roots. And right now it's just a whole bunch of young roots. But I can't take too much because I want the rest to survive. So I'm going to do this over the course of 1 or 2 years. I'm going to thin this out. Every time that I repot, I remove some of these heavy roots, creating more taper and a finer root ball. You might notice that there's a lot of roots here sprouting from the one space. So I'm going to remove this one, so that the one going down here is preferred. Here there's 2, and I want to remove the bigger one. Lift it, prune it, space. And this one I can shorten, so I don't want these big roots to go down all the way. There you go. Did you also see that? Once again, more substrate. It really is a multi-step process. You just keep on removing substrate as you see it, gently as you get closer to the core, because you don't really want to break anything in here that is of major influence. Now what you can see is that I've cut only very small roots, and here at the base of the root ball what you also want is as little roots as possible coming down. So you can here also with the knob cutter go into the root ball and say, well, there's a big stump, and I'm just cutting them out. This way creating a really flat base. This opens up the root ball further. More of these organics get space to come out, and you can go down and down and down. And as said, you can do this over multiple repottings, but the first repotting, the more you get, the better it actually is, as long as there's sufficient roots in the Nebari to take over. This is quite invasive. Now you might be wondering, how can you do that? And didn't I risk the health of the tree? The answer is no, I didn't risk the health of the tree. I can do this because most of the root ball is actually not needed for a tree. A tree takes up water and nutrients mostly at the end of the roots. The brown roots, they don't help so much. It's really these little fine roots. They take up water and nutrients. As a biologist, for me, it's logical that you can do this, because a tree will grow roots straight away once the season begins. But maybe for you, this is new. Most of the roots are just there to anchor the plant in a pot. And I thought I'd show you the view less seen. This is all the damage of the repotting. There's a lot of substrate and a lot of waste. But well, let's continue. Let's plant this thing into a container. Now I'll be potting it up in this very large container. It has lots of holes, and therefore I have some coarse pumice that I'm just going to put on the bottom to make sure that the finer substrate doesn't fall out. And if I say finer substrate, this is what I mean. This is a mixture of pumice, zeolite, there is some diatomous earth in there, and there's pine bark. That's roughly the coarse mixture that I now use as a base, and this is what, maybe 3 to 6 millimeters? What's that in inches? Don't ask me. It's about 1/8 of an inch, more or less. Anyway, this is well draining. If I water, the water will flow through. It holds nutrients quite well, yet you don't get a lot of stagnant water in there. This is my go-to substrate for pretty much everything. Now, to hold the tree in place, because as I said, The tree has roots mostly to be stable, and I just removed most of those. So 3 pieces of aluminium wire, 1.5 mil, quite thin. Just loop them through the holes in the bottom, make sure they are flush with the bottom. Do that 3 different locations, of course, and then I can start filling it up with the coarse substrate. Add a little bit of the thinner, then add a little bit of the finer substrate, add the tree on top, squiggle it in place, and then use a chopstick to move everything between the roots. Note that the coarse substrate really is only there to make sure this fine stuff doesn't fall out. It is not a drainage layer, it's just me being lazy. I don't want to put any mesh on the bottom of this pot. The nice thing about a round pot, there's no front, so I can just put it in, roughly vertical, and be done with it. Now this gently squishing down and moving and rotating aids in getting the substrate also between the roots at the bottom. So this is actually not just playing, this has a role. And then it's a matter of taking these pieces of wire. I like to loop them below the surface roots and find the opposing one, loop that one underneath the surface root through the root ball. I do it like this because then I don't get any marks on the surface roots. You can of course put them over the surface root. That's easier. You can see I'm fidgeting a little bit here. But then you have to make sure that you cover the wire. Now make sure that you just put it tight enough to hold it in place, but not tight enough to squeeze off the root ball. This is just a gentle process. It is there to hold it in place, but that's pretty much all of it. Now again, through the roots, if possible, and otherwise I can take a chopstick and make a little hole. Wow. There we go. Now it is quite important to gently fill the pot with substrate, and every time that you've added a layer you take your chopstick and you move it side to side between the roots. This way the substrate will work itself in between the roots, making sure there's no air gaps, and particularly the inside of the root ball is important because we removed a lot of roots. This is also the reason why I thinned out part of the root ball and removed some of these thicker roots, because now there's little holes and the substrate can actually be squeezed in those holes. Air gaps are the death of a root. So the more air gaps you have, the less healthy your root ball will be. I like to do this layer by layer, so I just add one layer around the pot, and once that is done I work it between the roots and then I add another layer, rather than filling it up and then trying to get everything between. And it's always surprising how deep the substrate can sink if you start wiggling the roots. So here also it is worth your time and your effort to do this well. Now all I need to do is water it well, and then this repotting is done. What you might notice is I've planted the tree quite deep, and that is with a reason. It is not because I want to use more substrate or I want to have a heavier pot or anything like that. No, if I plant it quite deep, it aids in developing new roots around the Nebari. You've seen there's quite a few thick roots, a lot of thin roots, but I have also removed quite a few roots. So I want to really develop more roots here around the Nebari. Then I am just going to water it, and if we get more frost, which I don't hope, it will go back into a shed. Let's see how this develops, and let's see whether the discoloration in the bark is actually a disease or whether it was just unhappy. And I'm not going to do very much with the tree. Now, because I think this tree might have been diseased, it's quite important to disinfect all the tools after this work. Normally it is not all that important. Do it every once in a while, particularly with species like Japanese maple. It is good to every once in a while clean it out. But if you have a tree that is, if you have a bonsai that you feel is diseased, make sure you disinfect your tools. And this was then a short overview of how to repot a tree that you got from a nursery into a bonsai, pre-bonsai container. If you have any questions, pop me your questions down below, and otherwise, see you next time in the next video. This was Jelle, growing bonsai